So, autoimmune disease is one of the components of this rising tide of chronic illness that is pretty much overwhelming the medical system and in the Western world. Okay, so we have this big instance of things like cardiovascular disease and diabetes and chronic inflammatory illness, and autoimmune disease is one of those, rapidly growing in number and not being particularly well served by the conventional medical system because it has an acute care model and this is a chronic illness. So the definition of autoimmune disease is that it's any disease that arises from a specific inflammatory reaction where the immune system has started to attack the tissues in the body instead of attacking non-self tissues, essentially. So it's defined as loss of immune tolerance to self tissue. And it has traditionally been considered an aberrant immune response, that the immune system makes a mistake and accidentally starts attacking self tissue. And actually, more recently, I've sort of had the realization that I don't think that that's correct. I don't think that when we're using the term aberrant response, when we're using the term mistaken reaction, when we're talking about the immune system making a mistake, I actually think that that's incorrect. I think that autoimmunity arises because the immune system is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing and having a massive inflammatory reaction in an attempt to protect us from a foreign protein, essentially. And the reason that it's attacking tissues in the body is because that tissue in the body has been changed in some way and now no longer looks like self-tissue to the immune system. So it was self-tissue, but it's been damaged or changed, and now it doesn't look like self-tissue anymore, and that's created the issue where the immune system has started attacking it, because it is still self-tissue, but it now no longer looks like that.
Okay. Yeah. Beautifully explained. I think that's a really good point as well, because when we think of some of the other common, let's just say, topics within the functional medicine space, so adrenal fatigue or low cortisol outputs, it's the same sort of principle, I think, because we start thinking about the why is the body lowering free cortisol? Yeah. And obviously one of the theories is to free up immune reserves to deal with a chronic infection. Yeah. So it's the same sort of principle, I think. If we start chipping away at that why and we appreciate the body's got that innate intelligence, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I actually think if we start reframing disease in that way, most of the time I think that we will actually find that the body's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, and we need to consider why is it doing that? What is it trying to protect us against? Mark Houston, for example, talks about high blood pressure as being exactly what the body's supposed to be doing. It's having a massive inflammatory reaction on the blood vessel wall in response to something like lead or an infection that's causing high blood pressure. And so we see high blood pressure as being a problem, in fact, the problem, and we stop our thinking at that, and we think the body's made a mistake and, that this is something wrong, when actually we need to be listening to that as a message, right? The body's trying to tell us something. It has a problem. It's responding to that problem. This is the result of that. And it was that conversation with Mark Houston that actually helped me have this realization around autoimmunity and then reframe my thinking around disease in general. We need to think about it as being a message. The body's doing something on purpose. It's not a mistake.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm not sure what the right word to use is, but it certainly feels more positive, empowering to think of it that way. It's almost, I want to kind of say that it's almost quite human ego driven to think the body's made a mistake, let's go and fix it. Yeah. Rather than actually the body's probably more intelligent than we are, and it's doing what it needs to do.
Yeah, exactly. Let's listen to what it's telling us, work with it. It also, I think it's an important thing from a patient perspective, because a lot of people feel like a victim of their body, or that their body has turned on them and is betraying them in some way. And instead of thinking about it like that if you think about it like your body's working with you, this is something that's happening for you so that you can change your life appropriately in order to be healthy. it's a completely different way of thinking about
Yeah.
it.
So
Can be kind of trauma.
yeah, that is what I was just trying to say but couldn't articulate. So no,
Yeah.
that's perfect. And as you say, I think it is. It takes us away from that victim perspective, which is brilliant.
Yeah.
And I increasingly think that is a real key part of getting well again. You know, that mindset and the perspective we're taking of the disease ultimately.
Mm.
So we've spoken obviously about an overview of what autoimmune disease is and this damage or change to cell tissue. So what would be potentially some of the things that might trigger or initiate this change?
So it's generally understood that to have an autoimmune disease in the first place, you need to have three variables in place, all of them. So you need to have the genetic predisposition, you need to have barrier permeability of some kind. So we talk a lot about leaky gut, but you can also have leaky lungs, you can have leaky skin, you know, it can be any of the barriers in the body, not just the gut. And then you need to have some kind of environmental trigger. And the environmental trigger can be a food. So, for example, it can be gluten or dairy or salmon, to be honest with you. You know, it can be any food. It can be stress, which is actually a very big part of developing autoimmune disease. And it can be a toxin or an environmental chemical of some kind, or it can be an infectious agent, so a bacteria or a virus. And the things that specifically change tissue, like if we're talking about it, what actually changes tissue from self to non-self, that is chemicals, hormones, and infections. All of those, and we can sort of dive a bit more into what some of those mechanisms are if you wanted to, but that's the sort of basis of what are the triggers and what are the things that primarily change tissue from self to non-self.
Okay, brilliant. So yeah, with I guess the primary topic to be today being on the infections, are there specific infections that are more well known and or more well researched to be potential triggers?
There definitely are, but to kind of back up a little bit before that, I think first of all it's important to understand that humans are mostly microbe, right? We are a human microbe kibbutz. There are more microbial cells in our body than human cells in our body. So microbes are an integral part of our immune system, and perturbations away from normal microbial ecology in the body affect our immune system, and vice versa. So things that affect our immune system, such as stress and toxins, then make us susceptible to the negative effects of infectious agents. So when we're talking about what are some of the infectious agents that can specifically lead to autoimmunity, some of those, of course, are actual infections. So things like chlamydia, for example, and some of those are microbes that are found in the body in a healthy person as part of our normal ecological system, you know. Okay. The second thing that I think is important to understand about infections and autoimmunity is actually the genetics involved. So the genetics involved in autoimmunity don't actually predispose us to autoimmune disease in the same way that we think about I'm just trying to think of something off the top of my head. So single gene diseases we tend to associate. So for example, if you have the gene for Huntington's, you are going to develop Huntington's. But you don't have a gene for autoimmune disease, right? Okay. So you don't have a gene for celiac disease. What the genes actually determine, the genetics associated with autoimmune disease actually relate to antigen presentation. So they're genes that affect the way somebody's immune system responds to environmental stimuli. And specific to antigen presentation, of course, that's how the body responds to infection. So if you have the genetics that predispose you to autoimmune disease, they're actually the genes that predispose you to response to environmental triggers. So I think that that's a really important thing to understand, because of course that's helpful in understanding how infection becomes involved. If you have a gene that predisposes you to an increased response to an infectious agent, you are much more likely in the presence of that infectious agent, especially if you also have stress or you're also having inflammatory reactions to gluten, likely to have a reaction to a bug that somebody else wouldn't. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense, yeah. And as you say, I think it really transforms the way we look at all of this ultimately.
Mm. So we're supposed to have bugs on board. It's possible to be totally healthy with bugs on board. Your genes predispose you to maybe having some extra reactions to those bugs. And when you layer another environmental factor on top of that, that changes that makes that immune response greater, then you have this kind of perfect storm. And there's a lot of research around the different ways that infectious agents, bacteria and viruses contribute to autoimmune disease. But some of the most common ones I think that people should be aware of are Epstein-Barr virus and like the herpes virus family in general, because they're so common. So a lot of people don't know that something like 92 to 95% of the population have Epstein-Barr virus. That 50% of people get it. 50% of the people that have it, which is almost everybody, get it before the age of 5. And the other 50% that get it in the sort of teenage and early 20s years, because herpes viruses and Epstein-Barr virus specifically transmitted in saliva. So the times that you are swapping saliva most freely are when you're a toddler and everybody's, slobbering on everybody else. And when you're a teenager, when everybody is slobbering on everybody else, right? So super common, and only 35% of the 50% of people that get it as a teenager or adult actually have acute symptoms. So most people have it and don't notice it. So Epstein-Barr is one. Candida is another one, actually, just because it's very common. And again, Candida and yeasts are supposed to be found in in the microbial ecology. They can be on board and not a problem at all. And in my experience, when you can have Candida and be totally healthy and it's not an issue. But if you are also immune suppressed, if you're also stressed, if you don't have good digestive function, if you don't have enough stomach acid and the pH of your GI tract is out, if you've got anything else going on, you're taking medications, you're taking the oral contraceptive pill, anything along those lines, you change your immune system, Candida becomes a problem, and that can start the cascade that leads to autoimmune disease. Some of the microbes in the mouth, P. gingivalis, for example, or strep musicans, super common. You can have them as part of a healthy body, but if they become problematic and you have other stuff going on as well, then it's almost a direct line to autoimmunity, really highly associated with rheumatoid arthritis, but also cardiovascular autoimmunity, because your gum surfaces are so porous and they're so highly vascular. So you can have leaky mouth, you can have leaky gums, and when you've also got a bacteria, that is populating your mouth in an unhealthy way, it's a direct line to your interior immune system.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I saw a paper yesterday, and I've only read the abstracts, but it was along the lines of they were looking at plaque formation in the mouth, and it was they followed the participants in the trial, and there was a really sort of statistically significant correlation with those who had more plaque and autoimmune disease, I think 30 years later.
Yeah, it's a very, very strong correlation. And not just, there are I think 100 or more than 100 systemic, like chronic illnesses that have mouth dental manifestations. And there are strong associations between the level of plaque and the severity of symptoms in autoimmune disease, and the level of periodontal disease and the severity of symptoms in autoimmunity. It's a really strong correlation. People don't tend to think about their mouth so much. It's sort of a separate, it shouldn't be, but it's considered to be a kind of separate thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really key point, actually, and an important takeaway for us. It's what pops into my mind is the idea of what we've had over the years from a brain perspective and viewing it as this isolated organ that isn't influenced by the body.
Mm.
And I guess the mouth is kind of still in that space where we view it almost like, oh, let's go and see the dentist, but it doesn't have any bearing over our overall health.
Exactly. And, so many diseases could be identified at very early stages. Like celiac disease, for example, could be identified in children just because of the changes in dental architecture, changes to the enamel is a very strong symptom of celiac disease in children. And dentists don't take it that step further. They just put a sealant on the tooth,
Right.
and send the kid home. There's no question about why is this happening.
So,
and I think that needs to change.
yeah. Out of curiosity, if you don't mind me asking, do you therefore do any kind of oral examination, or are you just kind of mindful of what people's teeth look like when they're talking to you and things?
Yeah, so a lot of my own practice is via Skype. So I'm not able to actually put my hands in someone's mouth, which I totally would do. But I do go through physical exam with people, and we do that with the camera, and I ask them to do their own exam. We talk through what they're looking for, and they send me photos, and I look at the tongue and I look at the teeth, and I ask them about their dental history, because I think that that's very, very telling. And a big part of what I'm trying to do with people in clinic is to help them to understand how this happened. Autoimmune disease doesn't just fall out of the sky and hit you one day.
Right.
You don't go to sleep healthy and wake up the following morning with rheumatoid arthritis. It's developing in the body for between 10 and 30 years before diagnosis as a general rule. And there is a whole cascade of events that happens that lead to autoimmune disease developing that start usually with the grandparents. Sorry, I'm going to cough.
That's good.
That starts with the grandparents. So we're looking at everything that affects the immune system from a family history perspective, from what was going on when they were in utero. So talking about what was going on with the mother when she was pregnant with said person, what happened with their birth, what happened in the first 6 months of life and the first year of life, and what happened in their childhood, and how every event layers onto their genetics and their experiences to end up in autoimmune disease. Because it's, we're talking about the triggers, but realistically most people don't just have a single event that created autoimmunity. It's usually a complex jigsaw puzzle of pieces, of which they might have 3 triggers, or they might have some events in their life that are both a trigger and an antecedent, something that sets them up for, it is a trigger in their health, but it also sets them up for the future trigger, which is the straw that breaks the camel's back and leads to them having autoimmune disease.
Yeah, I think, again, that's key, because I've probably made this mistake as a practitioner where I've almost viewed it as, this trigger, and if we can just deal with this trigger, then you're going to be great.
Yeah, exactly.
But doing some
that was how I went into it in the beginning. We have to find out what the infection is. We have to find out what the chemical is, because if I can clear you of mercury, then you'll be well. And if I can get rid of the candida in your gut, then you'll be well. And that autoimmune disease doesn't work that way, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think there are probably 3 things I want to just touch on there. One is doing a little bit of prep for today this morning. I was trying to get my brain in gear, and there was a paper basically talking about cumulative childhood stress and increasing significantly the risk of autoimmune disease. So that goes back to exactly what you've just said there. And I think that word cumulative is key. Again, going away from this one trigger and actually appreciating that if that infection is involved, there, as you say, there has been a backlog of probably cumulative stressors and changes in physiology that have allowed that to become as problematic as it has become.
Absolutely.
And actually, a client I saw 2 weeks ago now came to me. He had done some of his own testing, found elevated mercury, and really kind of got bogged down in this concept, quite understandably. But I, again, sort of viewed it almost as a symptom. And I don't know if I'm right or wrong here, but the way I framed it was, well, why has mercury accumulated in your body? He doesn't have amalgam fillings, he doesn't have loads of tuna, so we didn't have some of the bigger exposures, shall we say. So I started just thinking more about, obviously, nutrient status, because nutrients is key for detoxification and for every other real process in the body. And actually the mercury is the downstream consequence of other things already probably out of balance, so to speak, that led to that. And I get the impression it's kind of the same thing from an autoimmune perspective, which is we need to view it with a broader lens, at least initially.
Totally. So, and we sort of need to be thinking about all of the triggers. And so you've sort of said two things that I think are really important. Number one, childhood events. So there was a study that showed really clearly that adverse child events are a very big predisposition for autoimmune disease. And people that have a score of 2 or higher have a very greater risk of having a chronic illness and or autoimmune disease as an adult. And if you go from 2 to 3 adverse child events, then it increases by 70%, right?
Wow.
So adverse child events can be things like abuse, but it can also be things like, most of us have at least one, right? So it can be things like being teased or bullied. It can be emotional. It can be feeling lonely and feeling rejected, which, that happens. Kids are awful to each other, frankly, or it can be because your mum was always at work, or there's lots of stuff that happens that we kind of perceive as a trauma as a child. But the more of those that you have, the almost definite the outcome becomes that you're going to, because it changes your immune system, because it changes your stress responses also as an adult. So there's that. I've lost my train of thought now. So adverse child events. And so then the other thing, when you have an autoimmune disease, people tend to think about whether or not they're symptomatic, yes or no. And if you're in a flare and you have symptoms, then it's bad. And if you're not in a flare or you don't have symptoms, then everything is fine. And a really good analogy that I heard recently is you have to kind of think about somebody's autoimmune biology as a landscape. So think about it like a field, and in the field is a ditch. And when the person falls into the ditch, that's when they're in a flare and they have symptoms, and that's bad. And people tend to think if they're on the edge of the ditch, then they're fine. And if they're in the ditch, then that's bad. But when you're working with someone with autoimmune disease, the further you get them away from the ditch, that's actually what we're aiming for. It's not just not in the ditch, it's far from the ditch.
Okay.
Because people with autoimmune disease have specific triggers. So, and that would be things like infection, or a toxin, but there are also general triggers, right? So the specific triggers are specific to that person. I have celiac disease. Gluten is a specific trigger for me. But the non-specific triggers are things that promote inflammation and promote autoimmune disease in anybody. So gluten isn't necessarily an autoimmune trigger in everyone. But it is for me. So that's specific. But so general triggers are things like stress, work stress, overtraining, right? So physical activity that's too much for the body to handle. There's a very long list of these. Inflammatory, pretty much anything inflammatory.
Right.
So inflammatory diet, alcohol, all of those things are general triggers. And in order to move somebody away from the ditch, you actually need to be working with the general triggers. The more of those that you tidy up, the way that somebody sleeps, is a very big, has a very big impact on the immune system. So working with autoimmunity, you have to not just be working with like that magic bullet mentality of what is the specific trigger. Super important, because that is a direct way of identifying what will really tip somebody into a flare. But you also need to be working on the general triggers, and the more that you do that, the better resilience somebody will have for the specific triggers.
I'm so glad you've said that, because it's something that I think has been going on in my mind recently, supporting clients of so many people coming and desperate to know the why, and they want that final answer of what's going on, but at the same time they're not necessarily focusing as much on these more generalized concepts of sleep, stress, etc. And I've really tried to educate them around, actually, if we can just improve your resilience, if we can reduce that allostatic load, then I've kind of thought about it as we're freeing up resources in the body to actually go and do what it's designed to do.
Precisely, exactly. And you're reducing the total inflammatory burden on that body. You're exactly as you say, you're freeing up resources, you're freeing up immune resources, you're freeing up liver resources, you're freeing up nutrients, you're freeing up all of the things that then allow your body to fight an infection, that allow it to clear a toxin, whatever the specific triggers are. You're spot on.
Okay, good. Because it felt right, but I was also just like, obviously,
Yeah.
am I right?
Yeah. But listen, the healthier our body is, the better able it is to do what it needs to do, because your body will always work towards health. Your body has a fantastic capacity to do the things it needs to do if it has the resources to do them. So Lyme disease, which of course is an infection very associated with autoimmune disease, I think is a really good example of that. And one of the ways that I personally work with Lyme disease, and I don't specialize in Lyme disease specifically, but because I work in autoimmune disease, it comes across my desk really regularly. I don't really treat the infection for a long time, because I don't think that there's any point if somebody doesn't have a good gut, if they're not sleeping properly, if they're not doing some physical activity but not too much physical activity, and if their liver isn't working to detox the body properly. Because if you don't have those things in place first, you can't fight the infection. So right. There's a lot of peripheral work that you need to do to be able to do the specific infection work.
Yeah, and I was at a conference last year, excuse me, on chronic pathologies, and it kind of centered around Lyme to a large degree. And I have to say, I can't remember the doctor who did this lecture, but he was really talking about how you could have a client who got bitten by a tick, picked up, let's say, Borrelia, and actually was asymptomatic, but she went and got a jab or a vaccine when she was 17, 18, and that immune response then allows these organisms to become almost problematic, manifest, and then suddenly this person's got chronic fatigue syndrome. So again, even with Lyme, we go back to this cumulative exposure and the resiliency of the body.
Exactly.
So
I think it's perfectly possible. And again, like Epstein-Barr, I don't have any, so I've got figures about the prevalence of Epstein-Barr in the general population. I don't have those figures for Lyme disease, but I have started really thinking that I think probably everybody has Lyme. And I think it's perfectly possible to be robustly healthy and have Lyme in your body. It's actually the accumulation of all of the things that make you susceptible to Lyme being a problem. And I have an example in my own clinic of a patient who I didn't realize she had Lyme for a long time. She was referred to me by her endocrinologist for methylation work. And she had chronic fatigue, and she was having not seizures exactly, but very severe neurological symptoms. And her fatigue was pretty severe. And the most obvious thing to me when I went through her history with her was her gut. She had an acute infection in the gut, and she had many GI symptoms. And we started working there, and within 2 weeks of tidying up her diet to a low fermentation diet and popping in some antimicrobials, her fatigue was gone. She was back at work, back in the gym, and had no neurological symptoms.
Wow.
Like, it was really profound. And I was like, great, home run. Fantastic. But she, we worked on the gut, and there was a lot of issues around that. She had Ehlers-Danlos, and that made it kind of difficult to tidy up the gut really easily. But we persevered, and she did really well and traveled around Australia and did all of this great stuff. But she was having these relapses of symptoms. And after a little while, I said to her, okay, we need to do some more investigation. You are not progressing in the way that I would expect you to progress, considering how hard you work on your diet, how great your diet is, all of the good stuff that you've done, all of the supplements you've taken. You should be doing better than that. So we tested her for infections, and I looked at all of the viruses, and she was clear for those. We tested her for metals, and she was clear for those. And then I eventually said, look, you don't really feel like a Lyme patient to me, but it's the it's the last thing that I can think of that might be, um, you know, indicated in your case. So let's look at that, and sure enough, um, there she was. And but by that stage, we had been working together for about 18 months, and her gut was in really good shape actually by that stage, and her diet was immaculate, and we'd done a lot of work on the liver, and because she'd had a lot of work clearing the toxins that were coming from the gut, and she was, you know, sleeping really well and prioritizing self-care and prioritizing um, rest and relaxation, and you know, all of that kind of stuff. We'd done a lot of work on her immune system, making sure that her inflammatory and anti-inflammatory responses were balanced. But the Lyme was significant, and I recommended that she go and have work, and that she did work with a doctor. So she went off to Germany and was working with BCA Clinic. And that took 18 months. So she had a lot of co-infections, but she reported back to me that she was with a lot of people who had the same co-infections. She sometimes had them at much higher levels, much greater levels. She sailed through the treatment. She recovered, whereas the other people who hadn't done all of that precursor work were struggling. You know, she did the diet, you know, found the diet easy to do, whereas other people were struggling to implement that. Like, her experience of actually treating the Lyme was so different to the people that hadn't done that 18 months of work before they got there. And she recovered and is recovered, whereas the other people that were going through treatment with her have not yet and are still struggling, and they're improving and it's going well, but her experience was so profoundly different, and she's recovered as a result of all of that work that we did beforehand. So
brilliant.
Yeah,
I think, you know, further evidence really of this cumulative and foundational support work, I guess.
Absolutely.
And I think, you know, maybe tying that all up, there's a great video that I've watched by Cogence, if I pronounced it correctly, and they talk about I guess the variables that can be involved in autoimmune disease from an overview perspective, and they make the good point that chronic stress, we know, can disrupt the microbiome, we know can have an impact on the integrity of the gut lining, we know shifts us into what we call a Th1 dominant state, and they start to just feed off one another, because chronic inflammation can be caused by chronic stress, but will upregulate adrenal function and the stress response. And it was a really beautiful summary of actually appreciating, okay, this is all connected, but actually what we need to do to try and intervene doesn't necessarily need to be anything other than what we're always preaching ultimately around lifestyle.
Exactly, that's exactly right. And that, first of all, I love Cogence. I think that they explain the immune system so beautifully, and they've got some fantastic images that go along with the, you know, with explanations that are gorgeous. And you know, they do a really good explanation of the whole inflammation and autoimmune co-activation, and then how that all ties into stress. So stress and inflammation, of course, co-activate each other. So stress is pro-inflammatory and inflammation activates stress. And then both of those things can create or exacerbate dysbiosis. And then dysbiosis, you know, feeds into inflammation and it feeds into stress. And then all of that starts to disrupt your Th1, Th2, balance, and then that starts to disrupt when you're in an exacerbated state in either of those parts of the immune system. Then you're not in a tolerant state, which affects autoimmunity, and then that starts to drive Th17, you know, which makes autoimmune damage much worse, and then infection plays into that, because stress, of course, and imbalances in the Th1, Th2 tolerance system make you much more susceptible to infection, and that can be infectious agents that are part of your natural ecology. So, and then once that has happened, the infectious agents themselves start to perpetuate that whole cycle, because they then start to suppress the immune system. They have mechanisms that suppress your natural immune system's ability to fight infection. and it just goes around, and then you become more dysbiotic, and then you become more biologically stressed. It has nothing to do with psycho-emotional stress at that point. It's
Right.
biological stress, and you know, and everybody's actually in that, everybody in the Western world has some of that going on. You don't necessarily have the autoimmune picture, but for sure you've got some of the stress picture. For sure you've got some of the inflammatory picture. And if you don't have mechanisms in place that counteract that, then there's that snowball that starts to roll down the hill.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. And I think going back to what you said really at the very beginning around this whole genetic predisposition sort of maybe centered around the immune response to an infection or an organism, does that therefore partly explain why I think I'm right in saying sometimes people are responding essentially to their own microbial ecology, so IBS or IBD type situations whereby actually there might not be a acute infection certain it's detected, but from some of the research I've read, it's kind of implied that they're responding to their own microbiome, as it were.
Correct.
So is that again this idea of a body that's lacking resilience, lost tolerance, and actually because of maybe some genetic predispositions around that immune response, they're now essentially responding to something they shouldn't be?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. So, loss of tolerance, there are 3 different types of tolerance in the body. So you have oral tolerance, which is centered around the gut mucosa. And you have central tolerance and peripheral tolerance, which are part of the systemic immune system and centered around like the thymus gland and the T regulatory cells or T cells. But oral tolerance, when you break oral tolerance on that mucosal surface in the gut, you are pretty much primed to be reacting to any foreign protein that's found in that area. And the 2 foreign proteins, of course, that are found in high numbers in the gut are foods and bacteria, or not just bacteria, but infectious agents in the gut. So it is absolutely possible to lose tolerance to a bacteria in the gut that is considered to be a good bacteria, or anything that's in there, whether or not it's considered to be good or bad, but that's in there as part of your normal microbial ecology. And sort of that leads me into this idea that I think we've been thinking about bacteria as being good or bad. We've been thinking about microbes as being good or bad, and I think that that's actually outdated and really incorrect. With infectious agents, it's all about context as to whether or not that bug is a problem for you. So is it in the right location? Is it in the right number in your body? Is it part of a healthy, balanced ecosystem? Yes or no? Are you tolerating it? Yes or no? All of those things determine whether or not a microbe can be of benefit to your body or is actively causing problems in your body. And there is some more research around some of the lactobacillus species, for example, where in some people, lactobacillus can be acting as a probiotic, and in other people it can be acting as an autoimmune trigger specifically. It's not whether or not that bug is a good bug or a bad bug. It's about the context of your body. And within your body, the context of the microbial ecology.
Brilliant. So it might be worth us taking a step back, because we've just mentioned TH1, TH2 and TH17, and some people are probably thinking, what are they talking about? So at just a very basic level, would you be happy just to kind of almost define or give an overview of what we're talking about there?
Yeah. So in a healthy immune system, you have innate immunity and innate immunity. What's the other one?
Adaptive.
Adaptive. Thank you very much. You have innate immunity and adaptive immunity, and in your innate immune system is the immune system that responds immediately, and your adaptive immune system is the immune system that responds specifically. So think about it like this. If you went into town and you your shoes were stolen, and you had to you decide you're going to buy a pair of shoes so that you can get home, okay? And there are 2 shoe shops, one across the street from the other. So you can go into one And you can buy in that shop, there are a variety of shoes in popular sizes. So you could buy a pair of shoes. They might not fit you perfectly and they might not be awesome. They might not go with your outfit, but they will get you home. Okay, that's innate immunity. And then on the other side of the street, you have another shoe shop that sells shoes that would fit Shaquille O'Neal, ballet shoes, right? They sell shoes that are specifically made to fit your feet and to suit what you're trying to do, because you need to wear different shoes to play basketball than you do to do ballet.
Right.
Okay, but because they're custom made for what you need to do and exactly the purpose, it takes a couple of weeks to make them. That's adaptive immunity.
Beautiful.
So within within your innate, like within your immune system, then, so you have these two branches. One responds immediately, the other takes a couple of weeks to get going, but responds specifically to the infection in that instance. So that, I think, is an important thing to understand about how your immune system works. The second thing is that you have B cells and T cells. And B cells are the cells that make antibodies. And T cells, they have different classes. Okay, so you have T killer cells, which are different than natural killer cells, but you have killer T cells, which respond to kill a cell that is infected by a virus, for example. And then you have a class of T cells called T helper cells, and there are, within T helper cells, there are different classes. So there are actually, I think, 7 at this moment that have been defined, but when we're talking about autoimmune disease, predominantly we're talking about 4 of the different T helper cells. So you've got Th1, Th2, Th17, and T regulatory cells. So they are subclasses of T cells, each of which have a different activity and a different purpose in the body. So the balance is between T helper cells that are pro-inflammatory and a kind of an upregulation of the immune system. When your immune system is doing something protective or inflammatory, you've got that side of things. And then you have the off switch, which is your T regulatory cells, which are responsible for balance in the immune system. So Th1 cells are responsible for, actually, they respond to infection. Th2 cells are responsible for other kind of environmental stimuli. So responding to things like lost the word, parasites.
Okay.
And then Th17 cells are associated with damage, tissue damage in autoimmune disease. It's kind of the autoimmune pathway, and the more Th17 activity you have, the worse your autoimmune disease is likely to be. The more damage is associated, the more aggressive your autoimmune disease is likely to be. Now, it becomes a little bit more complicated because, of course, everything in your immune system is about balance. So everything is interconnected and communicating. So B cells and T cells balance it. They communicate with each other, they activate each other, and they work together to create appropriate immune responses. And then the T helper cells all also communicate with each other. So they switch each other on or off. Th1 signaling molecules will switch off Th2 and vice versa. So like a teeter-totter. T regulatory cells are supposed to switch off Th17 and Th2. Th1 will also switch off Th17. So in an autoimmune flare, in an autoimmune person, for example, where they have a very aggressive Th17 pathway and response happening, then part of what a practitioner can do to help bring that back into balance is actually support T regulatory cells and Th1 cells. And that's particularly pertinent if somebody's got an infection, because Th1 is the part of the immune system that fights infection in the body. So if you are just trying to focus on regaining tolerance and you're promoting tolerance in the body, and that is switching off Th1, Th2 and Th17, and that person has an infection and that infection promotes autoimmunity, you're switching off the part of the immune system that's fighting the infection. So you can actually, by promoting tolerance, make the autoimmunity worse. You have to create balance in the immune system, because inflammation is necessary, but inappropriate inflammation is problematic.
Right.
I don't know if that got too complicated.
I think if we listen to it again, we'll understand where we're at. Am I right in saying, because one of the ways I've described it to clients is the Th1 branch is a little bit more kind of intracellular infection, and Th2 is a bit more extracellular?
It can be, yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And from I guess going back to this concept that comes up a lot, stress, mm-hmm. stress can shift this a lot, I think I'm right in saying.
Definitely. So stress suppresses a lot of normal immune function. So one of the things that I see is that stress can downregulate appropriate Th1 responses, and it's part of how stress makes you much more susceptible to infection. But I find that it can be unique to the person, to be honest with you. So stress definitely suppresses normal immune response and makes you more pro-inflammatory. Part of the way that it does that is that it can upregulate Th17 and suppress Th1 or Th2 or both, and certainly makes it more difficult for T regulatory cells to create balance.
Okay. And if you're happy to share a little bit of wisdom here, because I'm sure practitioners listening might be curious around how on earth do we know what's going on from all of this? So are there tests, are there markers in tests that can start to at least shed light on where someone's at from an immune perspective?
Yeah, so basic blood chemistry is a really good way of recognizing that. So looking at small shifts in the white blood cells can actually help us to understand which pathway is upregulated and which not. So for example, if you start to see your neutrophil count high normal or slightly elevated above normal, you won't often see it really aggressively high, but elevated neutrophils would indicate Th17.
Okay.
And then the other markers, I'm going to have to look this up. Hang on a sec.
I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah. So the other markers that you would be looking at would be basophils and eosinophils, and the one that's associated with Th1 is, no, I can't remember. I'm going to have to pop that in the show notes.
That's okay.
Basic blood chemistry is one.
Yeah.
Other one. So there is specifically a lab called Lab for More, which does cytokine profiling. So if you wanted to understand where you're, and I do think that this is an important thing to do if someone is having autoimmune flares, is you can actually they do a T helper profile. So they will look at Th1, Th2, T regulatory cells, and Th17, and you can look at the balance and the ratios. But everybody has basic blood chemistry, and you can start to have a look and see are the white blood cells suppressed, like the total cell count. If that's slightly low, then that would indicate some suppressed immune responses, and actually indicates autoimmunity. I think there is a stronger correlation between the white cell count and autoimmune disease than pretty much any other marker, but that's just general for autoimmunity. Then when you start looking at the specific cells themselves, you can actually understand, okay, this person is, their Th1 is upregulated, their Th2 is upregulated, or their Th17 is upregulated, or down is the other thing. But then you can also do the specific cytokine panels and have a look.
Okay, no, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for that. So I'm mindful of time as always, and we've covered quite a lot, I think, within this little chat. And while it may seem, I want to say it may seem almost common sense in regards to some of the things we therefore want to be considering.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can start to conclude just with some ideas around interventions, lifestyle strategies, etc., to support individuals when we're thinking around this kind of cumulative concept to autoimmune disease and actually just disease generally.
Yeah, so I think there are usually 4 strings to that bow when it comes to lifestyle interventions. So first is identifying what the specific triggers are for somebody and creating interventions that are specific to that. But you might not be doing that first, but that's sort of one of the first considerations, I guess. So, for example, if you have Epstein-Barr virus, you're going to need some kind of antiviral strategy.
Okay.
The second is, oops, I forgot to leave the front door unlocked. Do you mind if I just grab that?
No, go for it.
Sorry. Sorry. So specific strategy. Second is immunonutrition. Okay, so working on reducing inflammatory foods in the diet and improving food, like increasing foods that specifically help to support the immune system in the body, and that is very specific to an individual.
Okay.
But a really important part of pretty much any chronic illness. Then the third is what I consider to be cell support. Okay, so tidying up nutrient deficiencies, making sure that oxidative stress and inflammation are in balance, and things like physical activity, sleep is sleep is almost the deal breaker, to be honest with you. Sleep and stress. And you can't necessarily remove stress from somebody's life, but you can do a lot of things to change the way a body responds to stress and to change somebody's perception of their stress. And both of those things, even without removing the stressor, will have a profound impact on the immune system and disease outcomes. And then lastly is actually, it's the kind of rebalance, right? You actually need to do a scan of that person's life and body and understand anything else which is having an impact. So that can be relationships, it can be so many things, but that's so specific triggers, general triggers, nutrition, sleep, stress, physical activity, hydration.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I really like that sort of overview. I think it covers all the bases, obviously. And I think you're right. I think sleep, stress, and for me, maybe I'm a bit biased with a bit of a fitness background, but I think the exercise component is isn't appreciated as much as it could be, from an immune perspective and sort of modulating some of these pathways and processes we've been speaking about. Yeah, I've got 2 things to say about that. I think physical activity is an absolutely necessary part of any immune program, or pretty much any rehabilitation program. If you're trying to promote health in a person, physical activity has to be part of that, because that is how our bodies were made to work. So in order for it to work properly, you have to be activating that. It changes so many variables in the immune system. But there is people, when they think about physical activity, they think about fitness, and being fit and being healthy are not the same thing. Right? Yeah. So we all hear about people, and these are extreme cases, of course, but we hear about somebody who was 36 years old and in top physical fitness who, dropped dead in the middle of running the London Marathon, right? Because that was not actually a healthy person, that was a fit person. And
excessive or inappropriate physical activity can make disease worse. So people, when they're working with somebody that has an autoimmune disease or any kind of chronic illness, might feel quite guilty because they're not going out for a run. Or when they're talking about physical activity, that's what they're thinking about: going to the gym, doing a Zumba class, running around the block, going for a 30-minute jog, something like that. And that's not necessarily what physical activity is needed in a body. That's a whole nother subject, and that's your expertise. It's not mine. I've got opinions about it, but that's not my background. But I think that that's a really important thing to understand, that being fit and being healthy are not the same thing, and physical activity shouldn't be stressful on the body, because physical activity can also promote disease. It's that there's a real balance that has to be struck.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it is a stressor.
Yeah.
So we just go back to this cumulative concept. And I keep it really simple with a lot of my clients from an exercise perspective. I would say more often, let's think about this. Well, let's say 50% of the time, I'll sit on the fence. I'm almost having to educate my clients and getting them doing a little bit less.
Yeah.
Especially of intensity or high intense work. And I kind of differentiate between, like you say, more the daily activity of a walk in the park and less the formal exercise of the spin class or the exercise class or doing a certain number of reps in the gym, etc. I mean, that has its place, but when we're talking about these kind of things, I think actually we want the walks in nature, and we want the lower intensity, low volume exercise as part of the healing process. And it's just, again, let's put it another way, it is freeing up resources again. Yeah. So I'm 100% with you there.
Oh, that's a relief.
Your opinions I agree with. No, that's great. Is there anything else, Robyn, just that you want to mention, go over again, or do you think we've covered enough for today?
Well, that is probably enough for today. I do feel like I have a lot more to say. We could maybe dive into, I mean, if we were to follow this up, we could maybe dive into a little bit more some of the more specific infections. So when is H. pylori a problem, for example? Talking about Epstein, barr, and viruses, and some of the mechanisms by which viruses change the immune system, and how do you approach how do you approach incorporating an antiviral program, and what are the things that I think are useful and not. I don't know, this,
That would be brilliant. Yeah, I think people would. I think people are going to want to know a little bit more of the specifics as well. So I think that would be a popular follow-up. And I think really important, because obviously if we appreciate, we mentioned before the show started, a paper I saw yesterday about organisms that can induce or inhibit an autoimmune disease. I think appreciating that we're not always going to want to go after this organism, so to speak, is critical.
Yeah. I think that's a really important thing to say, actually. Yeah, that it's not just about kill.
Perfect. Well, we've got a date in the diary actually for nutrition and its role on autoimmunity. So maybe later in the year, we'll have to jump on another Skype call and expand on this more.
Yeah, listen, Alex, I've got a lot of things to say about autoimmune disease. So we can talk about stress and autoimmunity and trauma. We can talk about diet and nutrition. We can talk about, there's so mane things, the mechanisms involved. We can talk about hormones and detoxification and toxins and autoimmune disease, and how haptogens trigger autoimmunity. I've got lots of things to talk about.
Yeah, and they're needed to be talked about, and people, I think, really these days are wanting to hear it as well. So I will be in touch then.
Sure.
I'll open up a week for us.
Let's do it.